Thank you, Professor Jaru, my graduate school friend, as she explained, for that introduction. And I want to say, well, I'm not going to be talking about nerd ecology today at all, right? The purpose of this is to give you an overview of how environmental humanities approaches can be useful to you in the classroom. And so that's really my focus. Although if anybody has questions during Q&A about nerd ecology, I would be happy to talk about that. So, or metahumanism, the second project. I thought that I would start with this image because this is an image from my town almost exactly a year ago when the hurricane remnant from Ida dropped 10 inches of rain in 4 hours. And this is a parking garage that was flooded basically to half a floor, right? This guy is in danger of being electrocuted. I'm not really sure why he was standing there. That was a bad idea. But in any case, this is an example of what happened all over our area, right? Basement apartments were flooded. Any buildings that were below like the regular level of the land, sub-basements, basements, they were flooded. So this to me is a sign of what we all know is already happening to our world, but it's happening faster than predicted. And furthermore, I mean, Montclair, New Jersey is kind of a Tony suburb, right? Stephen Colbert lives there, right? And I think that in some ways, like the suburbs of Northern New Jersey thought that we were protected from this, right? That what was happening in Queens wasn't going to happen to us, but it did, right? So the problem of the environmental humanities is trying to develop a way of talking about and analyzing and dealing with this problem on the ground relative to the way ecocriticism itself started, really as a way of understanding American and Anglophone nature writing. So I'm going to take us very quickly through the beginnings of ecocriticism and then explain how environmental humanities started to evolve as a kind of super field. And then I'm going to take you through Baker's dozen of terms that I hope will help you with your study and your teaching. So if we go to the Ecocriticism Reader, which is one of the canonical texts of the discipline from 1996, Cheryl Glotfelty, in her introduction, she's one of the editors and one of the founders of Ecocriticism, right? She claims here, and I think that this is fascinating for our purposes, that as of 1996, in terms of American literary criticism, you would never know that the Earth existed at all, right? That American literary criticism was preoccupied with a lot of other things, right? But then she said, you would never suspect that the Earth's life support systems were under stress, right? If you were reading American literary criticism at that time. So that is kind of the founding urge of ecocriticism, right? It's not just a kind of abstract analysis of American nature writing. It's always a kind of environmentalist analysis, right? Understanding that we are already in a kind of crisis, and then the idea of the crisis evolves, right? So one of the things that I want to note, because sometimes people oversimplify the beginning of ecocriticism, which was indeed very white and very American, but in terms of its analysis, there was always race, class, and gender analysis going on. But from Cheryl's point of view, the point of ecocriticism was to add place as a critical category. So if you want to think about this in what we would now call intersectional terms, right? She wanted to add place or locality, as an intersectional term. And so ecocriticism didn't want to abandon what was going on in the discipline at that point. It wanted to add on to it, right? And with some unexpected results. So Larry Buell's book, The Environmental Imagination, is important to us here for a number of reasons, but in part because I just want to insist, even though we're going to go beyond literary criticism soon, I want to insist that the idea of developing an environmental imagination in his sense actually matters still. And I want to be really literal about what environmental imagination means, right? At its very basic core, imagination is a faculty of the mind which allows you to picture things that are not there, right? And it's meant that all the way from the Middle Ages. Like, in other words, this is what it meant to Dante as well. And so developing an environmental imagination at base level involves understanding the more than human world, right, as it lives as our environment, but also as it dwells in our mind, or ought to dwell in our mind, right? So Buell says that one of the ways that you can tell you're dealing with an environmental text, right, is that it assumes that human history is embedded in natural history, that the human interest is not the only interest in the story, meaning, in other words, there's a non-human interest or interests in the story, that humans are accountable, right, to our environment or our world as part of the ethos of the work, right, and that in some sense, ecological processes are already recognized as part of the plot, right, or as part of the setting. So that's still a fairly narrow definition, which we're going to see gets expanded greatly, right? But that's where Buell started with the idea of the environmental imagination. So good to keep in mind. If you are interested in reading sort of baseline foundational eco-criticism from what Professor Slovik called the last time first generation eco-criticism, and a little into second, I would recommend these three works. So Gladfeldt and Fromm's The Eco-Criticism Reader, which is an anthology, very important as a sort of set of founding documents. Greg Gerard's Ecocriticism, which is more of a kind of Anglophone literary analysis of sort of central ideas, right, or analytic tropes, and Joni Adamson and her team of editors and the Environmental Justice Reader. Because another thing that is sometimes said wrongly about ecocriticism is that environmental justice, the idea that there are structural oppressions embedded in the way that human societies interact with the environment, that idea came later or somehow second, right? But actually it was there from the beginning, and the Adamson Reader is really the foundation of that wing of the ecocritical project. So here we are back in Montclair. So this is a picture of the downtown highway, right, the central road through Montclair, which is about a block away from where I live, right? And this is what it looked like during that downpour. And what you can't really see effectively is that there were trucks and buses and cars being carried away downhill by the water, right? So I include some of these images to remind us of where we are and what is at stake. There will be some more of them. So when we move from ecocriticism to environmental humanities, what does that mean? Well, what it meant practically from somebody who was in the middle of that process is that the three major founding environmental disciplines, namely environmental history, environmental philosophy, and ecocritical literary studies, like, it soon became apparent when we started to deal even just with representations of the environmental crisis, that our own disciplines and our own tools by themselves were not enough. And so what you see even in the 90s, but certainly going into the 21st century, is that the disciplines start to rapidly draw on one another, in a way that is recognizably interdisciplinary. And that began to form a space that has really been stable and has only grown, right, both nationally and internationally, to the point where this is now kind of taken for granted in the EH superfield, right, that you're not just going to talk about literary criticism when you're talking about climate change, for instance, if you're me, right? So as an English professor, as a literature professor, I am now responsible for understanding, right, all of those other interdisciplines, right, and the space that they form in this giant conversation that is now going on. And I should note that those aren't the only three disciplines. I mean, there's environmental religious studies, environmental sociology, environmental psychology. Like, those are now all very important. But in the beginning, there were those three that started to coalesce, and now the kind of disciplinary super network is building. And if you are interested in getting like a very quick down and dirty map, right, of the major ideas and the major trends in environmental humanities, I would recommend this book, The Cambridge Companion to the Environmental Humanities. Easily available in digital form if your library has a subscription to the Cambridge Companions. And spoiler alert, I'm one of the authors, right? So I just wanted to admit that like I am plugging this book, but it is a great book despite the fact that I'm in it. So here's the beautiful cover of that book. So this is what you're looking for. So you could get a really quick overview and get a lot of good tools for your toolkit just by reading this one book, although I'm going to recommend a bunch of others too. Okay, so perhaps some of you have seen the movie Parasite, right? And if you haven't, Parasite is Bong Joon-ho's story of a flood in Seoul, South Korea. And it's really a story of a rich family and a poor family, right? And this is, and what happens to them, like the differential effect of this super flood that they get. And this is the poor family crouching in their bathroom, taking selfies during the storm, right? In a bathroom where the toilet is about to explode, right? In a very, very graphic way, right? So Bong Joon-ho makes us look at like the explosion of the bathroom scene as the rest of the neighborhood is swamped, right? Because as is usual, the poor people live downhill, right? The rich people are protected by the elevation of their homes, right? And so all the water and all the waste literally rolls downhill into this apartment, right? And so I sometimes think of this as a signal, right, of what EH is dealing with now and the way we sort of see ourselves positioned, like waiting for the toilet to explode as a symbolic gesture. This is a still shot of Tokyo from the anime movie that in English was translated as Weathering with You. It's, as you can see, it's only a few years old. And what we are looking at is a permanently flooded downtown Tokyo, right? And one of the really interesting things about this image, which is why I wanted to juxtapose it with the Parasite image, is that in Parasite, the flooding, right, is portrayed entirely as a disaster, right? There is no upside. In this movie, which was really shocking to a lot of people when it first came out, and to me, the protagonists survive this kind of constant torrential rainstorm that has buried Tokyo. And what happens at the end of the movie, right, is that they look out onto what used to be downtown Tokyo. And it's just permanently this, right? It's permanently buried. People can no longer live there anymore. I mean, buried by water. But yet the way the film talks about it, right, is that, this kind of balancing or rebalancing was inevitable, right? And therefore it is ultimately good, although proximally it is a disaster for us, right? And I really think this is an interesting shift, right? Particularly when we're talking about seeing things from the more than human perspective, right? This disaster for the human city of Tokyo, right, turns out to be something that was always going to happen. It's represented as a kind of retribution of the cloud dragons, symbolically. And it's interesting too, because like no one in the film is actually sad about this. And so for those of you who are familiar with the great animator Hayao Miyazaki, right, this is, if you look at a 1997 interview, Miyazaki basically wishes for this, right? He says, I hope that one day, like Tokyo disappears under the waves. And, and so I think that this is a direct response to what, to me, and I think to a lot of other readers and viewers at the time, was sort of horrific. Like, how can you wish Tokyo under the waves as a good thing? And here is this, this latest 2019 anime saying, well, in a larger perspective, this was bound to happen, and now it's happened, and now we have to live with it, right? And so that's one of the great tensions inside environmental humanities, right? How to feel and what to think ethically, politically, right, about the ongoing disasters that we are now experiencing pretty much every year. So here's a breakdown of my baker's dozen, my 13 terms that I hope will help you teach and learn from the environmental humanities. First, keywords about materiality, then about time, then about society and politics, and then some other useful stuff. So first of all, materiality. So as the name suggests, right, eco-criticism actually does look to ecology as a science for some of its basic understanding of the way natural systems work, right? And it's sort of a point of pride for the first and second generations of eco-critics in particular, many of whom actually had scientific training in geology and ecology and biology. It's a point of pride to say we are always learning from science. We are always in dialogue with science, right? So one of the great examples of this in terms of an idea that you can use is the great critic Stacy Alaimo's idea of transcorporeality, right? So as you can see from the word, it basically means the quality of bodily throughness, if you want to translate it that way. And what she means by transcorporeality is that in the American tradition, we have been taught to think of living bodies as discrete entities, right, that have firm boundaries, right? So we can keep out what needs to be kept out, and we can bring in things only at our choice. And the concept of transcorporeality is important to Alaimo because she is very interested in theorizing what industrial pollution particularly does to human bodies and also to non-human bodies. And the point of transcorporeality as an idea is that what we think of as outside is always already the inside as well. And we are not directly in charge, for the most part, right, of the nutrients, the toxins, the elements, the molecules, right, and other things that we have been taught to think of as not us, right, because they are always traveling in and out of our bodies through the membranes in our lungs, through our skin, right, through nutrition and excretion. And so, not surprisingly, this is one of the most important terms that environmental humanities in English has come up with, right, because it's very useful in describing our actual lived condition. So I really recommend two books of hers in particular, Bodily Natures and the more recent Exposed, right, if you are interested in learning more about the way that Alaimo thinks about pollution and the way our bodies react with it. And the way we draw pollution into ourselves and it stays there. So this is a super important idea that I think will be very helpful. Also, it sounds really cool because it begins with trans, right? So people like it because it's fun to say as well. Now I wanted to introduce you next to a related term called vibrant matter by the political theorist Jane Bennett, right? And just to show you how far environmental humanities as a disciplinary network has grown, Bennett did not start out as an environmental thinker. She's a political theorist, right? And her work, right, which I believe started basically as a kind of analysis of post-Hegelian political thought, right? She has now turned to the environmental humanities and particularly to the idea of matter and beings that are not obviously alive as agents in ecological and environmental actions, right? So her idea is that, contra Aristotle, because this is the big thing, right, about her idea. If you follow an Aristotelian trajectory through European and American political thought, you're taught to think of like humans are the animal that we are the animal that builds cities, right? We are the people who have literally civilizations, right? And that is what distinguishes us from other animals in general, right? But really from anything else. And this quote here, political theory needs to do a better job of recognizing the active participation of non-human forces in events, right? This is a really important idea because political theorists are taught not to do that, right? Like the thing that acts in politics is supposed to be people and groups of people. But she wants us to think of Hurricane Ida and Superstorm Sandy and global heating as agents that have to be explicitly brought into descriptions of political situations. And in this sense, although I actually think that the central thinker in her work is still Hegel, She is aligned with the French thinker who just died, actually, Bruno Latour, very, very important thinker, who began thinking about how scientific facts are created using what he thought of as assemblages, right, of labs and people and non-human animals, right, and so on. That general theory is called actor network theory, if you are interested, ANT, if you're interested in following that up. But this is an important trend in EH across all of the disciplines in learning how to take into account and to recognize non-human actors, not just other living actors, but also floodwater and rock slides and so on. So that's important. So now I wanted to give you like one of the important hometown ideas from Professor Jaru. Her idea of environing at the margins seems very important to me. That this first appears, to my knowledge, Jaru, correct me if I'm wrong, in the Chinese Environmental Humanities volume. Is that right? Okay, right. So, so she says that environing at the margins is a consideration of modes, aesthetics, ethics, and politics of environmental, here's the big part, inclusion and exclusion, however the margins are conceptualized, right? And so this notion of margin and center is very important politically, but as she is pointing out, also aesthetically and ethically in thinking about the whole question of what an environment is, right? And how people live in it. And it's important in part because people are usually never taught the basic verb of that is the core of environment, right? Which is to environ, meaning to surround, right? So environments are always about what we are surrounded by. And if you hook that up with transcorporeality, right, you can see how this begins to build, right? An environment is something that you're surrounded by, but that you are also within, right? And that is moving in and out of you, right? And of course, on the political, right, and planetary level, the great thing about this idea is that it challenges American-centered environmental humanities discourses, right? Because that when you give Americans the chance to put ourselves at the center, we will, right? So I actually think this is a very important volume as well as a very important idea, right, in displacing the United States as the center of environmental humanities discourse in English. Okay, time and temporality. This is a tricky one. It's kind of thick, right? Because it has one of these big words that's everywhere now, which you're probably familiar with, the Anthropocene, right? So I wanted to, we could talk about this for a whole semester, right? But I wanted to very quickly just introduce my perspective on this important idea, right? So we have to remember that it is originally and primarily an idea taken from geology about the era of Earth history that we are in, namely the one that follows the Holocene, right? Which is the one that we thought we were in, right, until very recently. And the Holocene is usually defined as the geological epoch that begins after the last glaciation, the last retreat of the glaciers. All right, so the thing about the Anthropocene to the natural scientists who first articulated this idea, and Anthropocene means generally, right, the human era, right? What they were actually trying to say was, it's the human era because it is the era in which human activity becomes a dominant part of the geological record itself, right? So, which is kind of dramatic. So one of the things that's often quoted is the idea that future scientists or observers, whoever they are, will be able to identify our layer of time by the billions of chicken bones in it, right? Because globally we eat so much chicken. So that's what they mean, right? But it was immediately taken up by environmental humanists, right, to talk about other knottier problems, and these are only a few of the versions of this idea. So Jason Moore, who's a sociologist, a Marxist sociologist, talks about, it's not really the Anthropocene, it's the Capitalocene, right? In other words, the geological record is being influenced by industrial capitalism. The Cthulhucene, that's Donna Haraway, the philosopher of science, feminist philosopher of science, extremely influential on EH. This is her way of talking about feeling our way through the present trouble. Like we are in a moment where we are in trouble and we have to use what she thinks of as tentacular thought, right? It's a great idea to feel our way through the future and the present. And I'd be happy to talk about all of this in detail later. Now I've listed these two French writers, Bonville and Freseau, right? And their wonderful book, The Shock of the Anthropocene, and one of their ideas, the Phronocene, which means the epic of wisdom, because what they're trying to do is actually turn the discourse of crisis around, right? To say, here are all of these more positive ways that imagine that we can act upon the disaster, right, in order to mitigate it, right? So they talk about, among other ideas, an epic of wisdom, right, which drives back, right, and ameliorates the things that have already been done, right, in the Anthropocene. So you can think of, for instance, the effort to transition to carbon-free sources of energy as a strategy of the Phronocene, right? Because names matter, and The Shock of the Anthropocene is a great book to get clarity on what other things we could call this era rather than simply centering the problem itself. Okay, so Kyle White, very important philosopher. He's a member of the Potawatomi Nation, so he's Anishinaabe culturally, and he does environmental philosophy from an explicitly indigenous perspective, right? And he is very interested in disputing the Western tradition of talking about linear time exclusively, right? Particularly time that progresses from one good thing to a better thing, right? And he wants to emphasize that from a North American indigenous perspective, time is bound up in relationships of kinship. And those are not just blood relationships, right? Or family relationships. There are systems of kinship, all the way through the non-human world into the realm of spirit beings, right? So when he talks about kinship time, he is talking about the time that you must take to reestablish relationships, right? For instance, in the Pacific Northwest with the salmon people, right, who are a major source of food, right? In the Great Lakes, which is where the Potawatomi are originally from, you have to devote your time to cultivating wild rice and being in relationship with wild rice, and so on, right? And this goes on into into the realm of like the true spirit being discourse, right? Like thunder beings in lightning storms, and so on. Like, so indigenous time, he describes it not as a line, but as a spiral where time does move forward, but it tends to circle around, not only seasonally, but in terms of the quality of relationships that come unraveled and have to be rebuilt and have to be maintained, and so on. And one of the other important ideas that he emphasizes, and he's not the only one who does, right, is the idea of apocalypse from an indigenous perspective, because from the perspective of indigenous peoples in North America, like the last 500 years have been an apocalypse that they are living through. And that really turns apocalyptic environmental discourse on its head in a number of important ways, because we're always worried in the white American tradition of environmentalism that the apocalypse is always about to happen. And he's like, yeah, yo, by the way, like it is happening and it has happened to us, right? So he's a very important thinker in terms of reevaluating the notions of time that are implicit in our ways of talking about environmental actions, networks, histories, right, and crises. And in that respect, this very new book by Mark Bold, The Anthropocene Unconscious, is also very important because he takes his cue from Frederick Jameson's famous book, The Political Unconscious, right, which claims that the Marxist meta-narrative of class struggle, right, wherever you are in an artistic or aesthetic analysis, right, however disjunctive somebody seems, right, in the present relative to their tradition, they can be fit into this giant meta-narrative of history, right? And what he's saying is we can think about the Anthropocene in the same way, right? As generating an enveloping meta-narrative, right? A super story in which, right, basically any kind of literature or art can be interpreted, not just the ones like, so remember back to Larry Buell, not just the ones that are explicitly environmentalist, right? Or that are about nature per se, right? He's saying, you know, if your thing is the Victorian novel or your thing is postmodern playwriting, right? Like the Anthropocene as a concept can take you in a way that the idea of the environment could not before, right? And I think that that's really important because it allows us, like everybody's always looking for like, what are the top 10 books about the Anthropocene that I can teach in my classes, right? And they always go to, I mean, to really excellent books, right? Like Flight Behavior or New York 2140. And those are great works to teach. But basically he's saying, if you introduce a framework of the Anthropocene, right, you can actually teach anything as long as you look at it from the perspective, right, of the ongoing crises of the Anthropocene or whatever you're calling it. Right. So of course, this goes along really well with the idea of the capitalocene, but you don't have to be a Marxist to use this idea. And I think that this is crucial because one of the things that I think has held back eco-criticism before is a kind of overly literal idea of what environmental literature means, right? And now that we're moving into the figurative, that can be very helpful to all of us. Okay, society and politics. Robert Bullard's, he's a sociologist, idea of environmental racism. He founded an entire subfield, right? This is an incredibly important idea. And very basically, environmental racism, according to Bullard, is racism that has environmental effects and environmental causes, right? So he is interested, right, in the intersection of racism, classism, and place, because the classic places that he is analyzing and that he wants to draw our attention to are communities of color that are put in danger because they are surrounded by, for instance, factories that spew pollutants into the air that everyone breathes in, driving up the level of heart attacks, the level of cancer, the level of deadly asthma, right, in these communities. It also connects to indigenous communities in the sense that, for instance, when you are dealing with extractive technologies like uranium mining, for instance, right, the people who are usually recruited to be those miners, if the mines are on indigenous land, are indigenous people, right? And so, of course, the Navajo, to take the example of the uranium mines, the Navajo experienced an overwhelming surge in cancer, right, after they started mining uranium. And so he wants to say, this is straight up racism, like it's not something else, right? And it's also taking advantage of poor people because poor communities, even white poor communities, as in West Virginia, right, in the post-coal environment, right, they are also this kind of community. And so he brings our attention, right, to the politics of how this all happens. Like, why do incinerators suddenly appear in poor communities in cities? And why are the Navajo the ones that are targeted for uranium mines, right? And part of the answer is this classic idea of NIMBY, not in my backyard. And the idea there is that, you probably heard of this before, it's an old idea, but it's an important one because it says that communities that have enough leverage politically because they're richer, right, and because they're whiter, have the power to reject, right, the incinerator plant, right, or the factory, and say this can't, like my child cannot breathe in these fumes, right? And so this is the kind of thing that environmental racism allows us to talk about. And there's plenty of literature that talks about these problems. I mean, fiction, right, and poetry, if you want to talk about that later for use in class. Rob Nixon's idea of slow violence is super important here. It kind of is a twin to environmental racism in the sense that environmental racism is often used in the American domestic context, and slow violence is often used in a post-colonial or neo-colonial international context. And what Rob Nixon means by slow violence is the kind of violence that afflicts people and the land and the air and the water in a way that cannot immediately be perceptible, right, as a catastrophe, right? Very important. Like, so what he wants to say, and this kind of always makes me giggle a little bit because he's right, is that there's a kind of sensational, spectacle-driven notion of what an environmental disaster is that Hollywood has taken plenty of advantage of. Like, if you've ever watched The Day After Tomorrow, which is a classic giant environmental disaster movie from Hollywood, it's not that there is no such thing as a fast-moving disaster, but what he wants to say is, right, once Shell Oil goes to Nigeria, right, and it takes the oil that it wants and it leaves, right, the oil is still seeping into the water and into the land and poisoning the people who live on that land, right? And you might not notice it because it doesn't happen as, in terms of an immediate spectacular crisis. So slow violence and that's the name of the book, by the way, Slow Violence by Rob Nixon. That is a really important concept that has spread very quickly because, unfortunately, it's highly applicable, right? And so one of the things I want to point out here is that slow violence, actually, his analysis tends to emphasize the people who are being hurt by slow violence as agents and as resistors, right? Not people who are simply letting it happen to them. Like, he wants to get away from the idea that, that in post-colonial or neo-colonial situations, people just sort of lay down and take it, right? Because they don't. So that's another important part of this idea. Queer ecology comes at a similar set of ideas from a different angle. Obviously, it draws on this idea of queer studies and queer identity. And in particular, and by the way, the book by Katrina Sandilands and Bruce Erickson is called Queer Ecologies, plural, because they think of this in a multiple kind of way, right? But the term itself as the subfield is queer ecology. And queer ecology as a method wants to break apart the traditional idea in European thinking that we have inherited that nature, capital N, right, is the great mother who is also the great reproducer, and the person who tells us that our primary biological and social function is to create children, right? So the notion of queer ecology is part of the resistance in queer studies in general to scripts of reproduction, right, to scripts of the heteronormative family, right? And it also particularly wants to highlight the way that Darwinian theories of evolution, and the origin of species have been taken up very famously by eugenic and social Darwinist movements in the 20th and 21st centuries, to say, a woman's place is really to be the mother of the nation, right? Women have to stay at home and have as many children, right, for the nation as possible. And of course, this is an explicitly white supremacist idea that we are seeing already, right, in the surface of American culture at the moment, right? That women need to, like, you should not be in charge of your own reproductive capacity because the nation needs you, or else you're going to be overrun by brown people, right? I mean, and that's explicit. Like, there's so many examples of the way, like, I'm not inferring that, right, from the rhetoric. That's simply what the rhetoric says. So queer ecology is part of the theoretical pushback to that idea. And on the positive note, it also investigates what it thinks of as multi-species eroticism and what has been called ecosexuality. All right, one of my favorites, Climate Leviathan. Here we are back in political theory. So Jeff Mann and Joel Wainwright are political theorists who have tried to think about the planetary political regimes, right, that could address climate change. This has been this is one of the most teacherly theory texts I've ever used, right? It works great in the classroom because you can say to students, here are these 4 models, right, of what planetary politics could look like. Which do you choose? Explain your choice, right? What do you think are the drawbacks of each? And it really forces students to think through, right, what they think the international order should look like and should do about the climate emergency. So I'll just go through very quickly there, the categories are familiar, right? If you're a political theorist, at least. So climate Leviathan is the idea that there would have to be a planetary government led by neoliberal capitalism, right? That would stabilize the climate through market and corporate agency, right? So if you want to think of it this way, it's sort of like what billionaire climate realism would look like, right? So it's like put Elon Musk, et al. In charge of the planetary metabolism, if you want to think of it that way, right? And everything will be fine. The second one is climate Mao, right? Authoritarian socialism, and the idea then is that the first block would be led by the EU and by North America, right? Climate Mao would be led by China. The idea goes, right, and it would use the centralized command structure of an authoritarian government, right, to work much faster. The idea would be than liberal capitalism, with representative governments could work, right? So the idea would be like Xi Jinping and company say like no more coal, only solar and wind, and then that happens, right? That's the theory. Climate behemoth is sort of like, they couldn't say this, but I would say it's climate Trump, right? Or climate Bolsonaro, or climate Orban, or climate Modi, right? So in other words, it's a global climate structure that runs through what appears to be only nationalist fascist discourse, but is really an alliance of the right, right? And so, we can see that, we can think of what just happened in Brazil in the elections as an overt clash between climate behemoth, represented by Bolsonaro, and climate X, represented by Lula, right? So what is climate X? I listened to a podcast with Mann and Wainwright, which also you could give to your students, very useful. They did a lot of talk for this book, which is great. They said explicitly that as political theorists, they're not allowed to imagine another system in their professional capacity. So they couldn't say, here's the utopian way out of this, even though they have one. They were like, professionally, we don't do that, right? And what they actually said, and I thought this was a fascinating moment for EH, they said, this is why we need art. This is why we need literature and history, right? And the humanities and the arts that deal with narrative and representation to imagine this possibility of what they're calling climate X. What is that? I mean, they hint that it's sort of like utopian, anarchist, right? Everybody joins hands at the local level, which forms a giant network at the global level. And of course, that has a utopian sound to it that they were not really allowed to talk about, right? So even though that frustrated me as a reader, it delighted me as a teacher, because you can say to students in this assignment, as I actually have done, right? What do you think climate X should look like? Like, if you don't like the other three, make your own system. Like, what should the climate future be like? X equals what, right? And that worked really well. All right, I was delighted by the results of that. So I really recommend this work and that approach if it fits your goals. So finally, other useful stuff. The idea of Ecomedia, right? This subwing of the environmental humanities is led by Salma Manani, Stephen Rust, and Sean Cubitt, who are all film theory people and film history people. But what Ecomedia means in general is moving beyond the question of the representation of the environment in print and explicitly centering film, right, digital television, podcasts, all sorts of digital media, and of course also music, right, and the other arts that can be broadcast, not just literature, by digital means, right, or filmic, cinematic means, or televisual means. So Ecomedia is starting to theorize broadcast media and digital media as central to the discussion of environmental culture. Internationally, right? It sort of begins it's sort of born as an international collaboration, which is great. The second, and of course there are books called Ecomedia, so that's easy enough to find. Also, please use those names, right, as key terms, and you'll just be led to a wealth of information. And of course, for those of you who teach digital media and film, right, this is a great way to not have to go through environmental literature to get an EH frame, right? That's what this is explicitly supposed to do. The second useful thing is this concept of earth emotions by the Australian philosopher Glenn Albrecht. And the book is also called Earth Emotions. And what Albrecht is saying is that this condition of the Anthropocene that we are now living in is producing new emotions and reshaping old emotions. So for instance, he has this very influential term called solastalgia, based on nostalgia, right? Meaning the feeling that you get. So like nostalgia is the idea of I've been separated from home and I long for it, right? Solastalgia is I'm still living in my home place, but it is changing in front of me in ways that produce dread, right, and grief, right, among other emotions. And the other earth emotions are not necessarily the difficult ones. Like there's also earth joy, right, and so on. But the idea of like the emotional life, right, of the environmental humanities, very, very useful with students, because then you can give names to the things that they've been feeling, and they can talk about their feelings in a way that both allow them to take hold of their own reactions, right, but also to be conducting an analysis, like not just blurting, right, or even representing, but like reflecting, right? So the earth emotion vocabulary is very good for creating an atmosphere where students can reflect on their own feelings about what's going on. And I've done that successfully, like it can be done, and others have done that too. And the last idea that I think is great and needs to be tested is the botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer, who, like Kyle White, is Potawatomi and Anishinaabe. She's very interested in getting English beyond the idea that all non-human beings are it, right? Plants are it, birds are it, right? And so rivers are it. And so she said, like, what do you do? Right? We don't have a pronoun in English for the personhood of non-human beings. And so, long story short, like if you Google Robin Wall Kimmerer he kin, like you'll come right to it. But she has written a number of influential articles where she's argued that, and she's narrated the fact that she worked with a Potawatomi elder who speaks Anishinaabewim. And they got to this very, very long word, because Anishinaabe has very long compound words. And the last syllable, like to mean earth being, right, creature of earth, right? And the last syllable was ki, right? And so she said, okay, English speakers are not going to say this polysyllabic word, but they might say ki, right? And the plural she wants, and then you can see like where the plan comes in. The plural would be kin, right, which is already an English word. And so you see, like if you connect Kyle White and Robin Wall Kimmerer, they have an evil plan, right, to introduce a pronoun which emphasizes the idea of relationality and personhood, right, in community with the non-human world, right, which they want to revolutionize, right, the way people talk and think and feel and relate to non-human beings, right, because they think this is the time. So, if like me, your institution is trying to figure out how to introduce better pronoun systems, right, you could really shake things up by using ki kin. And interestingly enough, there is no possessive, right? She has refused to make the possessive form. I'm not quite sure why. It could be philosophical. I've tried to ask her this, but of course she's inundated by email and, and she can really never answer. Maybe in some later work she'll answer this, but in any case, like it would be up to us, like actually using a language system that didn't say it for non-human beings to decide like what a possessive pronoun based on ki kin would be. So I think that's a great idea. And the other idea is that like there can be pronouns that don't actually like define gender, which I think is a fascinating and excellent idea. So I really recommend her work in general. She's fantastic. So thank you for weathering with me. This is my contact information. If you would like to get in touch with me to talk about this more. And of course, I would be happy to take questions now. Thank you for listening. How are we going to do this?
Yeah. Well, thanks everybody. And well, personally, I really enjoyed this talk and I learned so much. And how much time we have left? Like 10 minutes, 20 minutes. So we can take some questions from the floor, also on from Zoom. So if I don't know if Jose can help collect some questions, or maybe I allow that people to interact, please. So people can type their questions. Oh, I'm sorry. I should be closer to the microphone. Please, if people on Zoom, if you have questions, please type your question here, and then we will start to read your questions aloud. And if you have questions from the floor, you can also ask now. Okay, please, Carl.
Hi, Anthony.
Hi, Carl.
Good to see you.
Do we need to give
I
you
have a selfish question.
Yeah.
A bit about the relationship between critical animal studies and environmental humanities.
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. Carl Steele asks, can I talk about the relationship between critical animal studies and the environmental humanities? So I guess, I mean, honestly, Carl, I think that your answer will be better than mine, but I'll take a swipe at it. So critical animal studies is really a kind of vanguard subdiscipline in my mind, because before we really had, a collective identity called environmental humanities, critical environmental studies, right, interestingly building out of the theoretical heritage of deconstruction, right, among other things, was already talking about the problem of the category of the human, particularly versus the animal, but also just in terms of human nature, right, human environment splits, right? So, I mean, my first reaction is that critical animal studies is important particularly important if you are doing a kind of work with your students, because I'm going to answer this in a pedagogical way, and then you can tell me like what else you do, right? Particularly if you are trying to work with students in literature that either has a very sharp distinction between the human and the natural, or the human and the animal, and you want to undermine that, right? Or if you are dealing particularly, in global literature with cultural systems that don't make that kind of distinction, right? And yet, like Anglophone readers are going to impose a sharp distinction on the text and therefore misunderstand it, right? And in that sense, critical animal studies, looks both ways to say, like, we can help you no longer have that problematic dualism, right, in the way that you're reading. We can help you undermine it, because that's what deconstruction is really good for, among other things, right? Or we can, we can clarify that it was never there to begin with, right? And so, there's a whole heritage of critical animal studies that, if the talk were like 45 minutes longer, I would have been able to go into, but seriously, critical animal studies is a great subfield, like very, very important. But before we leave that question, Carl, do you have any recommendations about what to teach or how to teach it?
Well, tomorrow I'm teaching some Derrida, The Animal That Therefore I Am, along with Kafka's Report to the Academy. I'm also teaching later on in the semester, Yoko Tawa's The Bridegroom Was a Dog, which is why the kind of interesting kind of Japanese fable approach to this, but written in German, I think. I guess the follow-up to this question very briefly, because it feels to me that part of the question is maybe a question of scale. The environmental humanities seems to work on a very, very large scale, or a different temporal levels, different time scale than critical animal studies works with. Does that hunch feel correct to you?
I think that it does feel correct to me relative to what has been done before. Are we okay? Okay. So I think that that's an accurate description of what has already happened. However, one of the things that I hope I got across a little bit in this presentation is that one of the great things about environmental humanities as a network of disciplines is that if you want to scale up a discourse that has been very local, or you want to scale down a discourse that has been global, but you need it to be more place-based, right? That's part of what the EH network of disciplines can do, because now there is some place where, for instance, right, I can talk about the Anthropocene unconscious and the flooding in my hometown, right? And so for instance, we can talk about gay werewolf narratives in medieval literature, right? But then connect that. I mean, that can seem very culturally far away, or maybe much too close, right? Right, if you're a gay werewolf romance reader, that subgenre totally exists. But anyway, like the power of EH is a way of saying, right, like let's start with Derrida, right? This animal, tell me the title again. The animal, therefore I am. I always get that wrong. So we can start with Derrida and cats, for instance, right? And then we can ask questions about, well, what if we take a critical animal studies approach, right, to the question of the ratio between domestic livestock, right, and wildlife, right, where actual wild animals as a matter of sheer biomass on Earth has radically dropped, right, in the last 50 years relative to livestock, right? And then suddenly we're back at the Amazon and Bolsonaro and the Brazilian elections, right? So I think this is the kind of connection that animal studies absolutely should be part of,